Hello, and I welcome you to the course on EU-Russian relations. We're going to have our first lecture today, and the first lecture will be about ideas in Russian foreign policy. Okay? So, before I start, or actually I would like to start with a quote from Sergei Tatishev, who at some point said that the foreign policy of a great nation is not shaped arbitrarily or accidentally, but evolves over the ages in response to the nation's needs and interests. And this is extremely important because when we speak about ideas of Russian foreign policy, the additional basis of Russian foreign policy, we do speak about some trends that have been there for quite a while. And then, of course, we will cover some trends that appeared recently following the collapse of the Soviet Union. So these are sort of like two trends that we're going to discuss. We'll spend most of the time on something that has been there for quite a while. Yeah? And then we'll mark some new tendencies as well. Okay. So the first thing that is important in this particular regard is a dilemma which in fact departs from the development of the Russian state. And in the screen I have three different maps. One map is the map of Russia from the 17th century. Another map is the map of Russia from the early 20th century, and then the map of the Soviet Union. And if you look at the map of the Soviet Union and the map of Russia from the beginning of the 20th century, you will see there is quite a big similarity. And then, of course, there is a striking difference between the Russian state at the beginning of the 17th century and Russian state in the 20th century. So basically, Russia has this mentality of a continent-wide power, and that's very important. It actually stretches well, in Europe and in Asia. And this very phenomenon, the phenomenon of how Russian state developed, led to two dilemmas in Russian foreign policy. The first one is the dilemma of imperialism versus nation state. And the second one is the dilemma of Russia being a European or Eurasian state. So let's cover each of them one by one. So starting with imperialism and nation state. If you look at the development of the Russian state, then we will see that the development of the state, or state building, and empire building were not distinguishable. So they ran parallel to each other. And there's a very famous phrase which is attributed to Count Witte, who at some point said that I don't know Russia, I only know Russian Empire. And that was because no elite wanted to jeopardize its status, no elite breeded any sort of nationalism, and the state and nation building, state building, ran in parallel to empire building in Russia. There were, of course, limits to Russian imperialism, like the fear to fight against an international coalition. And that happened, especially in the 19th century. Another limit was the limit caused by the political, administrative, and social constraints in Russia. But still, Russia has been a multi-ethnic state for most of its history. And only recently, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia emerged as an ethnically homogeneous state, which is a prerequisite in a way for a nation state. But at the same time, because state building and empire building were not distinguishable for most of the history of Russia, the very identity of the Russian state became an issue at the beginning of the 1990s, because it was not very clear what it meant to be a Russian person and what it meant to have a Russian state. And I have three different quotes here. One from Igor Zevelev, who argued that Russia emerged from the Soviet Union as an incomplete nation with a surprisingly low level of national consciousness, precisely because it has always been an empire, so like sort of like the backbone of the empire. Ivan Kravtsev talked about the following pillars of the project of the nation state: natural resources being one, the memory of the Soviet Union, of the glory of the Soviet Union being the second one, and the promise of sovereignty, sort of like the idea that Russia will be a really, really sovereign state on a par with other key powers. And then Sergei Ivanov argued that the new Russian triad consisted of sovereign democracy, that's one, strong economy, that's the second one, and then military power, that's the third one. Yeah? So these are sort of like various ideas that were put on the table to sort of like generate the idea of Russianness, the idea of what it meant to be a Russian. Yeah? I will mention a few other building blocks for the Russian identity, for the Russian nation-state construction. Well, the memory of the Second World War is extremely important. And it's important because it's probably the most uncontroversial event in the Russian history. Yeah? Whoever you talk about, or whoever you talk to, yeah? Actually, and I can disagree on many events in the Russian history, but virtually everybody will agree that the Second World War and the victory in the Second World War was one of the most glorious moments in the Russian history. And this is why the 9th of May is celebrated so much, and this is why it became a symbol of the Russian identity. State is a key modernizer. Yeah? The centrality of the state is definitely another aspect of this sort of like nation building, nation construction. Yeah? And in the competition between state being the key modernizer and civil society and business being key modernizers, the state clearly wins the first place. There is no doubt about that. Yeah? Although Russia is proclaimed to be a federation, the vertical of power, yeah, and the centralization is extremely important as well. Yeah? So Russia is a very centralized state, and this centralization is pretty much there. Has always been there, well, with the exception of the 1990s, but that has been briefly restored afterwards. The role of the church emerged as an extremely important factor for the identity building of Russia as well. And I mean the Russian Orthodox Church. Although Russia officially is a multi-confessional state, Russian Orthodox Church clearly enjoys the centrality. And you will see at big church celebrations, Russian state officials visiting the church and sort of like spending some time with the patriarch, and that's important for sort of like for this identification of the Russians, and of like it's important for breeding this sense of Russianness in a way. Economic power, clearly an important factor, a newly important factor, although it's still a big an open question whether it's mostly about energy or whether it's mostly about IT. With the arrival of Mr. Putin, the dictatorship of law became a very important component. And this is, of course, different from the rule of law. And the dictatorship of law is being more sort of like imposed from above, yeah, as opposed to the rule of law, which is strongly supported by the civil society. But the dictatorship of law is clearly a very interesting and component of the new Russia. And then, of course, Russia has always stressed that it's a democratic state with its own peculiarity. Yeah? And the notion of democracy is very controversial in Russia. Yeah? Because on the one hand, Russia asserts that it's a democratic state. On the other hand, democracy is frequently associated with all sorts of instability that emerged in the 1990s. And therefore, sort of like there is this uneasy feeling about democracy. And lastly, well, Russia does respect human rights, but the concept of human rights is again very peculiar, because it's clearly the rights of the group, yeah, that prevail over the rights of the individual. And then, of course, Russia pays much more attention to economic and social rights, and less so to political and civil rights. Yeah? So that's, in a way, is important. For the nation-state building, and this is something that is in the center of this process. But at the same time, of course, imperialism in a way maintained its role in Russia as well. And since 1993, Russia has always had a sort of the Monroe Doctrine in the near abroad. And the near abroad, like we have a very strange and interesting classification of having a near abroad and a far abroad. Near abroad consists of the republics that formed parts of the Soviet Union, and then the far abroad, of course, is the rest, yeah, of the world. So basically, as of 1993, Russia has this type of a Monroe Doctrine in the near abroad, saying that whatever happens in the near abroad is of direct interest for Russia. Yeah, and Russia would like to have privileged interests with all post-Soviet countries, probably with the exception of the Baltic countries. Russia is interested in sort of like promoting Russian interests there, and of course the quality of the relations with those republics depends on how well they promote Russian interests. And Russia would ideally like to see an economic union, a security union, and probably joint peacekeeping. However, and this is a very important however, Russia doesn't have the power or the financial means to restore the empire. Anatoly Chubais, at the beginning of this century, in 2003, talked about the need to adopt the ideology of a liberal empire, of the one that promotes human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, and relies on economic business interests and on the promotion of Russian language and culture as the main sort of like tools, as the main leverages for the advance of Russian interests and for the maintenance of the position of Russia in the near abroad. And then, of course, different Eurasian integration projects can be conceptualized in the same way as Russia promoting its imperialism. Russia, of course, has strong great power ambitions. Russia is used to being a great power. Russia has been among key great powers since the 18th century. And therefore, and this is partly sort of like the reason why Mr. Gorbachev is so unpopular in this country, because it is believed that he lost the empire. And it is also strongly believed that the West exploited Russia in the 1990s. The picture in the West is, of course, completely different. The picture in the West is that Russia followed a democratic route in the 1990s and then turned back to a more authoritarian regime at the turn of the century. But the Russian vision is that Russia was open for the cooperation with the West, and then this openness was, in a way, used and abused by the West. In the current circumstances, Russia is quite clear that it cannot restore a bipolar world, but at the same time, Russia clearly wants to create a polycentric world. That's the concept that Russia promotes, with Russia being one of the poles, or with Russia and Eurasian Economic Union possibly being one of the poles. Russia has a strong desire to be on equal footing with key superpowers. This is, of course, strongly affected by sanctions that have been in place since 2014, but generally and strongly Russia wants to sort of like be on a par with other superpowers. And Russia emphasizes a lot independent foreign policy. The foreign policy that is based on Russian interests, that defines Russian interests, and that is not just departs from the idea of the coalition of democratic countries. The next dilemma, which is due to Russian geographical position, is the dilemma of Russia being a European state or Russia being a Eurasian state. And of course, geography as well as history is responsible for many things. Geographical rapprochement that took place in the 18th century sort of like contributed to Russia becoming one of the major powers in Europe. And then, of course, throughout the 18th century, Russia tried to copy European political system, European economic arrangements, some cultural issues. So it was a genuine borrowing, but it was also sort of like borrowing with a mixture with some traditional features. And therefore I have a quote here from Fyodor Dostoevsky, who at some point said that we Russians have two motherlands, our Rus and Europe. Our sort of like Russian Eurasian identity and our European identity. It's a very nice presentation. But that sort of like led to many clashes in Russian political thinking in principle and Russian foreign policy thinking in particular. With Westerners saying that a close relation with Europe and the West is essential for everything in Russia, and that Russia has to just become like any other European country. And then the Eurasianists would sort of like broadly say that Russia has a specificity, and therefore Russia has to rely on its geography, on its history, on its culture for its further growth. So rather than imitating, it has to develop an original sort of like set of ideas and to adopt its original course. And then, of course, we've had sort of like many different debates between sort of like Europeanists on the one hand and true Russia proponents in the 18th century. Yeah, so we had a Slavic idea which was very strong in the 19th century, and we had Eurasianism of the early 20th century that is being sort of revived in a way and rebranded at present. Yeah, so what does Russia have to do? Does Russia have to align with Europe / the West? Yeah, there is a difference between Europe and the West for Russia, but that's it's a different issue that we're not going to discuss in details in this lecture. Or does Russia have to rely on the Eurasian ideas and have to develop sort of like its own natural model, yeah, the model that is suitable for it and that is beneficial for Russia. If we go to the Soviet time, then the class struggle and the communist internationalists in a way suppressed this debate between Europeanists and Eurasianists. It was not an issue for the Soviet Union at that time. But the collapse of the Soviet Union, in fact, led to the revival of these very debates, with Russia sort of like having to decide one more time whether it's with Europe, and therefore it just has to copy all European recipes, or whether it develops its own original course of actions. And in the early 1990s, Russia went through liberal westernization, where it tried to associate as closely as possible with the West, and it basically made every effort, yeah, to align its realities with the Western ones and to align its foreign policy line with that of the West. And I have here a quote from Andrei Kozyrev, who said that at some point that for a democratic Russia, the United States and other Western democracies are as much natural friends and prospectively allies as they were natural adversaries for the Soviet Union. That's quite telling. However, already at the beginning of the 1990s, Russia started to face quite a lot of problems. Russia had to go through severe economic reforms, and that was due to the transformation from the planned economy to the market economy, but it was also due to the collapse of the Soviet Union when many production chains were destroyed. Russia had to deal with nuclear weapon that was left in Ukraine, Belarus and Kazakhstan, yeah, because Russia was recognized as the only successor to the Soviet Union in terms of the nuclear power. So all nuclear weapons had to be removed from all those countries, and that was quite a costly enterprise. Russia had to deal with secessionist movements in the post-Soviet space and with the flow of refugees that resulted from it. And last but not least, Russia had to deal with the ethnic Russians left abroad. And Russia felt that instead of the assistance, it actually got requests about the Soviet debt from Western partners. And that was believed to be not very fair. And therefore, already at in the beginning of the 1990s, Russia sort of like became slightly disillusioned with this blunt westernization. And that disillusionment only grew. And in the mid of the 1990s, we had a profound transformation in the foreign policy, with Mr. Kozyrev, the first Minister of Foreign Affairs, being substituted with a more balanced and less pro-Western figure of Evgeny Primakov. At the very same time, a very famous philosopher, Panarin, argued that there are two different options for the Russian development. One is the Atlanticist one, which is very promising, but at the same time Russia is economically weak, and Atlanticist policy leaves Russian eastern frontiers unprotected. And therefore Panarin argued for the Eurasian course of development. He argued that the Eurasian concept was preferable because it didn't expose Russian weakness, and it actually contributed to Russian security in Asia. The 1999 campaign against Kosovo led to the complete disillusionment with the West and to sort of like a turn to a more balanced Russian foreign policy. But then, of course, the Eurasian model did not become dominant either. Yeah? And Russia continued to oscillate between this pro-European and pro-Eurasian course. And here is another slide that I would like to consider, I would like for you to consider, and that's a slide about European Russia. If you look at the Russian territory, the biggest part of the Russian territory is of course in Asia, in geographical Asia. But then 60% of the Russian population lives in the European part. Over 50% of the Russian trade is still goes to Europe. Most communications, most industries are in the European part of Russia. Russian educational system is pretty much European. Yeah, we are members of the Bologna process, which is obviously a very nice illustration of that. And Russian culture is firmly rooted in the European culture. Yeah? So there are many trends that sort of like ground Russia, yeah, sort of like that embed Russia in Europe, but at the same time they do not necessarily translate into a pro-European policy, pro-European foreign policy, whereas Eurasian ideas always help to explain Russian specificity. And here I have also a quote from Levada's studies, you know, which were, well, one of the studies which was extremely interesting and which argued that sociological polls demonstrate that subconsciously Russians fear European influence, the European way of life, mentality and democracy. All of it for them seems quite foreign and not quite understandable. So that's very interesting, and I just like tells you about this unease about pro-European orientation. This is of course accompanied by a very painful discussion for Russia about where Europe ends, yeah, where are the limits of Europe. And when we speak about Europe, there are of course three broad definitions of Europe, or all definitions can boil down to three. Yeah? One is the geographical one, yeah, that's the clearest one, the most universal, I guess. And this definition says that the border between Europe and Asia runs through the Urals, which of course is a big question in terms of whether Russia makes like the question of whether Russia belongs to Europe, yeah, very weird, yeah, because we can either say that a part of Russia belongs to Europe and a part of Russia does not belong to Europe, pretty much like Kazakhstan or Turkey, or we should say that Europe stops at the western frontier of Russia. Then there is a cultural definition, and the cultural definition says that European civilization, yeah, European culture, has three pillars. And these are Greek traditions of democracy, Roman tradition of laws, and Christianity. Well, this definition is quite controversial for European states, yeah, especially if you treat the issue of Christianity. But then, of course, like there is an additional question of whether we cover all Christianity or only Catholic and Protestant branches of it, leaving aside Eastern Orthodox Christianity. However, when Russia speaks about Europe, Russia firmly insists on the cultural definition, saying that culturally and historically, of course, it's a part of Europe. And then last but not least, there is the so-called values definition, which is promoted by the European Union. And the values definition says that any state which is in the vicinity of Europe, but which respects human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, can be recognized as a European state. This is the definition that the European Union uses, and this is the definition which in fact disciplines the current political elite, because it clearly says that it's the responsibility of the current political elite whether a state is recognized as European or not. And this sort of like responsibility of the current elite is in difference to the cultural or geographical definitions of Europe. What is also very important for Russia in this definition is that some external party, the European Union in this particular case, actually takes the responsibility for defining who is Europe and who is not Europe, what country is European and what country is not European. And this is an issue for Russia because Russia says that, well, look, it doesn't actually matter. Yeah, we don't have to prove that we are a European state. We actually are a European state because of our culture, and that's it. Full stop here. Yeah? So this dilemma of European versus Eurasian is very pronounced in Russian cultural debates, identity debates, and of course foreign policy debates. Now we move to new trends, and the first trend that I would like to mention is the trend of de-ideologization. De-ideologization is a very tricky word. De-ideologization initially was put on the table in the beginning of the 1990s, and the idea behind was that Russia would follow value-based and interest-based foreign policy rather than foreign policy that is based on the ideology of Marxism and communism. Yeah? So it doesn't actually mean the absence of ideology, but was initially against the communist ideology. At the same time, if you look at various concepts of Russian foreign policy, you will see that foreign policy is frequently portrayed as a battle between patriots and westernizers, between державники and liberals, between nationalists and pragmatists, between liberal westernizers, pragmatic nationalists and fundamental nationalists, between liberals and siloviki, or sometimes even between liberals and Syrieviki. There are all sorts of concepts here. I'm not going to stop at any of them. Yeah, you can go into details by yourself. There are many items of recommended literature that I cite below. But the idea behind is that still there are additional sort of like points in Russian foreign policy. So de-ideologization hardly happened. So de-ideologization is mostly about the refusal from the communist ideology, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Russia is deprived of any ideology. And then, of course, pragmatism is a very important issue here, because pragmatism became sort of like one of the buzzwords in Russian foreign policy. With different politicians, I mean, in different aspects, yeah, sort of like understanding pragmatism in a different way. Primakov, for example, who brought this pragmatism in the debates for the first time, thought about pragmatism as balance between the West and the others. Mr. Putin gave different definitions of pragmatism, ranging from the tight correlation between objectives and means, yeah, through sort of like talking about different issues with different partners, and therefore sort of like showing them the need to cooperate with Russia and the basis for cooperation with Russia in different ways. Yeah? Sort of like talking about the historical heritage with the post-Soviet countries, geographical proximity and security and economic ties were also important there. Talking about Russia's European identity whenever European partners are around. Or talking about Russia being a Eurasian country whenever he talked to Asian partners. Yeah, so different discourses addressed to different partners, which of course can be conceptualized as, say, a sort of opportunism, but at the same time it can also be addressed as a very positive attitude, as trying to sort of like find common ground with various partners, especially given the complexity of the Russian geography and the complexity of Russian foreign policy. Furthermore, values competition became very important. And this is where we come to a sort of new dimension of of foreign policy in general. So it's not only Russian foreign policy, it's in a way universal, because various competition and soft power ideas are so much important for international relations of today. This is why I would like to briefly touch upon the dilemma between values and interests, which became very sound at the turn of the century, with many researchers arguing that Russia bases its foreign policy on interests, whether its European partners, the European Union in particular, emphasize values. Actually, we can hardly differentiate between values and interests. Yeah? These are sort of like different levels of discourse. Yeah? Any interest is based on values, and any values produce interests. Yeah? So it's not quite correct to say that Russia only depends on interests and the European Union only takes into consideration values. Yeah? So the the reality is much more complex. But it's true that Russia speaks much less about foreign policy and democracy, about democracy and human rights in its foreign policy than the European Union. And at the same time, Russia tries to sort of like define its specific position on many of these issues. For example, Russia clearly privileges sovereignty over human rights. Yeah? And Russia is very uneasy about the responsibility to protect, saying that we have to respect sovereignty. And if there is an issue, then we have to make sure that all parties sit at the table to negotiate future arrangements. Russia clearly emphasizes human rights of the group over human rights of the individual. And the famous case with Pussy Riot is a very good illustration here, because Russia argued that the rights of church believers were much more important than the rights, civil rights of 4 girls that tried to express that position. Russia also argues that you cannot privilege one group over another whenever you speak about the resolution of some sort of an international conflict. Yeah? Because when you privilege one group over another, you just sort of flip the sides, but you don't change the situation dramatically. Russia clearly privileges economic rights over political rights. Russian-speaking population in the Baltic countries and their rights are very important for Russian foreign policy. Russia has been extremely critical about any effort to revise recent history, especially the history of the Second World War, because it believes that it can diminish the role of Russia through these revisions, and this is something that goes to the core of Russian identity of today, and therefore Russia is critical of any sort of any effort to revise history, which of course is in a way a barrier for an academic tradition, but that's something that Russia, at least officially, defends. Russia insists on the equality and on the equality in the application of international law, or application of international law without prejudice. And this is the argument that was very pronounced when Russia compared the cases of Kosovo on the one hand and Crimea on the other hand. Russia tries to promote conservative values, over liberal values, especially when it comes to family values. And of course, Russia tries to sort of like insist that it's a democracy, but at the same time that it's a sovereign democracy, so it's a democracy which should not be told what to do and how to do correct. In the words of Sergei Lavrov, sort of like democracy and market relations are universal values, but at the same time they acquire their specificity and their sort of like cultural dimension whenever they are developed in any country, and therefore Russia just has a particular form of democracy or a particular form of human rights. So these are sort of like values that Russia tries to promote in its foreign policy. And the last phenomenon, new development in Russian foreign policy, is of course its economization of foreign policy. And this is of course very new, and this could not emerge before the 1990s. It emerged together with the development of the market economy in Russia and private business. And Russia painfully looked for a balance between the state on the one hand and the business on the other hand. Between the duty of the state to guarantee stable conditions for economic development and the duty of the business, or at least a commitment of the business to contribute to Russian foreign policy. So this is still an issue for Russia. It will probably be an issue for the future to come. But it's a completely new sort of like dilemma for Russia, and a dilemma that Russia has resolved in different ways, or has resolved in different ways since the beginning of the 1990s. And of course, economic factors became very salient, with Russia being interested in business, with Russia being interested in the WTO debates, with Russia being pretty much concerned about sanctions, without actually being explicit about it, or trying to diminish the influence of sanctions rhetorically, but looking for the ways to at least minimize them at the company level. And I have a very famous quote by Dmitry Trenin here, who argued that fluctuating energy prices rather than nuclear warheads are what really matters for Moscow. Yeah? Which of course also emphasizes strongly economic interests, but also gives a very good hint that Russia still relies pretty much on natural resources to feed its growth, which is debated in the country, but which has not changed substantially so far. So, drawing conclusions of this lecture, I would like to stress that there are three features that are traditional for Russian foreign policy: the debate between imperialism and nation state, great power ambitions of Russia, and debates between Western versus Eurasia. And then there are three features that are new and that have to be sort of like put in the picture as well, and these are the alliance of economic factors, de-ideologization, and renewed competition for values, or for the right to define the values, for the right to define what is the norm and what is normal in today's foreign policy, in today's international relations. And with this, I would like to say goodbye to you and to welcome you to our new lectures on EU-Russian relations.